Hello and welcome back to Theology with Mr. L. I'm Mr. L, Jason Leuzzi. Good to see you again. So today is just part of our series of me just answering questions for my 8th graders, as well as now my 6th graders are joining us, so this is a good time. Now, the two questions that I'm going to be answering today have to do with Mary. And the first question is, did Mary die? And the second question is, why did God choose Mary to be a mother at such a young age? Both of these are great questions. We should be able to answer them fairly easily. So let's just jump right in. Before I jump in, though, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And let me know if you have any questions. Leave them down below, all that kind of stuff. Any follow-up, anything like that. I'd love to talk to you guys in the comments below. So there you go. So I think it seems maybe like a strange question off the bat. Why did Mary, or did Mary die? We might be saying to ourselves, well, why would anyone ask this? Well, we have to remember in Catholic theology, right, that we believe that Mary was assumed into heaven at the end of her earthly life. Right, so at the end of Mary's earthly life, she was taken up into heaven, body and soul. Now, with that term, end of her earthly life, someone might read that and think, okay, well, it doesn't necessarily say she died. But then even to take it a step further, someone might ask this question because as Catholics, once again, we believe that Mary was immaculately conceived, right? Which means that when she was conceived in her mother's womb, right, that she was spared from original sin, right? That she does not have original sin at all, right? Because God was preparing her for her to be the mother of Jesus, right? So now the thing with original sin is that there's all kinds of effects of that, right? That you and me all know, right? One of them is concupiscence, right? Which is just a fancy word for humanity's attraction to sin. But as we read in Genesis, right, one of the effects of original sin is, in fact, death. So someone could say, well, hang on. If death is an effect of original sin, and Mary was without original sin, how could she die? And that's really at the root of this question, right? So the answer is a little bit... there's a very clear answer, but at the same time it gets a little muddied, so just bear with me, right? So, as I said, we know that Mary is immaculately conceived. We see that in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 1, verse 28, when Gabriel appears to Mary and says, "Hail, full of grace," right? Indicating that she has the fullness of grace within her, right? The fullness of grace within her is another way of saying that there's no sin blocking or lessening the grace that she has, right? So the church, right, let's just start off with that. So the church has always taught and believed that Mary is immaculately conceived, as well as the church has always taught and believed that Mary died, right? And I want to be clear and I want to be specific in my language, right? So the church has always held the belief that Mary experienced what we call bodily death, right? That she died right here on earth. And so that's what the church has always believed. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, okay, why is that and all that kind of stuff? Well, we have to understand, right, that this is something that's been kind of confirmed all throughout the church, and then it's kind of made clearer by different theologians and things like that. You know, St. Thomas Aquinas specifically talks about this in question 27 of his Summa Theologica, right? And he just references the idea that Christ too was without original sin, but he chose to die, right? And so in the same way that Mary was without original sin, right, and she chose to be united with her son in that way, right? Now, that doesn't mean that she experienced any suffering with that death or anything like that, but she experienced death. Now, that's what the church believes, right? That's theological opinion within the church, right? That Mary died. Now, the tricky part is that this isn't something that we necessarily read about in Scripture, right? We don't necessarily hear about Mary's death in Scripture, so then there's a lot of questions that come up with that. And once again, this is why as a church, right, we don't just lean on sacred Scripture, but we also have sacred tradition. And so our understanding of this comes from sacred tradition, right, that she was assumed body and soul into heaven. But like I said, there's not all that concrete evidence necessarily for some of these things. So what makes it unique, so the church does believe that Mary experienced bodily death. However, it is what they say licit, which is the church's way of saying that it's okay, it's not wrong, it's not what the church necessarily teaches, but it's not wrong to believe that Mary didn't die. right? And instead the term we would use dormition, right? That she experienced this great dormition, that it's as if she fell asleep into a very deep sleep but never experienced death, right? And that in that dormition she was then taken up into heaven. This, like I said, is not what we would say, this is not the opinion of popes and doctors and fathers of the church. However, it's an opinion that you can believe within the church, and the church says it is licit, right? That it's okay. All right, so there you go. Did Mary die? We don't really know. The church believes that she did die. However, it's also okay to believe that she didn't die, but that's not necessarily something you'll see backed up as much within the church. So there you go. Hopefully that answers your question. It's a good question. Like I said, it's a bit tricky because the answer is that we don't really know, but we answer with faith and kind of what we believe. So there you go. The next question: why did God choose Mary to be a mother at such a young age? And this is a question that's really it's a fair question, but it's one of those questions that makes it hard for us to understand because of the time in which we're living, right? That it's one of those contextual things, right? One of those things that we have to understand in the context of the time period in which things were taking place. So right off the bat, once again, like I was saying before, we don't necessarily have a specific age that Mary was. So we don't necessarily know specifically how old Mary was. For me, I've heard that Mary was between the ages of 13 and 16, so somewhere in there, right? And certainly, we hear 13 to 16, that's so young. But once again, we have to put it in context, right? That for someone to be married between 13 and 16 was the norm, right? And that's exactly what Mary was. She was married to Joseph, right? So we hear that and we think 13 to 16, that's crazy, all right? However, in the context of the times, very normal, right? And this is one of those things where, like I said, we just have to remember that we have to see and view this within the context of what kind of was going on. So it would have been very appropriate for someone her age to be married. And if she's married, then it would also be very appropriate for someone her age to be having children, right? And so that we can kind of follow that logic a little bit. So right off the bat, we're like, whoa, that seems so young. Why would God do that? Well, because it was normal at that time. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Certainly, we could just look to the fact that culturally they understood that a girl became a woman when she was able to have children and be a mother, right? And so that's a bit different than how we would view a person becoming an adult, certainly within our society. And so right off the bat, that's something to consider. But then we also need to consider that life expectancy, right? So how old people lived was much younger than it is today. And then even more so, right, that child mortality rate, or infant mortality rate rather, which is just a fancy way of saying the likelihood that a baby will live or die after they're born was also incredibly high. So there's a very high chance that even if you were to carry a baby full term and then deliver that baby, there's a good chance that baby could die. So in a sense, you wanted to start having babies as soon as you could, so that way you could keep trying to have children, because there's a very good possibility that your child wouldn't make it, right? So you could give birth to 10 children and 5 of them survive potentially, right? And things like that, right, makes things all the more pressing, right? That as soon as you can, you should start having children, so that way you can have as many children as you can have. It's a very different way of thinking than how we would think, but it's also the benefit of living in a time in which we live. So, like I said, I want to just be clear. We can't think of Mary and her conceiving Christ in her womb within the context of today's age, because the time in which she lived and the things that were appropriate and acceptable were very different. Even like I said, at the earliest, if Mary was 13, today in the church, you can't even legally, church legally, but also governmentally legally, get married at 13, right? And so right off the bat, the church would even be like, yeah, that wouldn't work today, which is why God did what he did when he did it. And that's really important as well. So all within God's time, all within God's plan. Just want to make sure that I've answered everything. Yeah, I think we're good to go. All right. It's been real. This is Theology with Mr. L. I'm Mr. L. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Like I said, if you have any follow-up questions or any comments you want to make regarding the material itself, please throw them in the comments below. It's been a lot of fun. See you later. Cheers.